Yes, welcome back to How Did I Get Here? This is, of course, the show where we're asking people, well, how did you get here? We recently hit 20 episodes here on the show, and our first ever episode was with a politician, so we're going back to our roots. Joining me today is Fatima Payman. She's an Australian senator for Western Australia, the third youngest senator in Australian history, and is the first hijab-wearing woman to be elected to Australian Parliament. She was elected to Parliament last year, and after nearly a year in politics, I should say, she joins us here on the show today. Fatima, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. And just a slight correction, I'm the fifth youngest, not the third.
Oh.
I think I need to update that Wikipedia.
I must have gotten that off Wikipedia. Anyway, well, let's jump into it. We always like to start at the beginning here. You came to Australia at a very young age as a refugee from Afghanistan. Can you tell us the story of how you came to arrive in the country?
So it wouldn't have been possible if my dad didn't risk his life and jump on a boat in 1999 to find a safe haven, a place that, you know, he could have a future with his family, a safe environment, but a land with opportunities. And I think Australia was definitely on top of the list. And I think not having my dad for about 4 years in my life was quite challenging in terms of, you know, growing up, you're in those tender years of wanting both your parents around. And so there was this long yearning to just reunite with dad. And 2003 is when he sponsored a SOVA, and my mum, sister and brother and I joined him.
Those 4 years without your father, I believe you're in Pakistan at the time. You know, how did that impact you as a young person?
It definitely felt lonely. I would feel quite jealous or envious of my cousins who had both their parents around. It was a lonely feeling of wanting to see dad, and all I had was a photo of him that we would sort of refer to, or we would hear his voice occasionally on phone calls. But yeah, it definitely was difficult. And I think the only thing I remember when we landed in Australia is seeing dad for the first time, and it just felt like home, you know?
Yeah. Looking at some of your family history, you're not the first politician in your family. Reading up your grandfather, he served in the Afghan parliament. Can you tell me the impact that maybe that political history of your family has had on you?
It's interesting that dad didn't speak much about grandpa being involved in politics, and I think it just wasn't, because of the political situation of the country, wasn't something that, you know, you openly spoke about. But I do recall references being made here and there, you know, in family gatherings, and that's how I picked up that grandpa was involved in the government just before the Taliban sort of came in and started destroying the place.
Looking back now, do you see it as an important part of your personal history, your family history?
Oh, 100%. And I think it must have been in my blood, because I pursued, biomedical science, wanting to become a doctor, wanting to then move on to pharmacy, and it just didn't work out, right? Like, brought me right back to what my calling was, and I think that was politics, and it in its truest element and form was just serving the community.
Those early years in Australia after you moved here, you were quite young, but what was that adjustment like? What were those early years like for you and your family?
So not being fluent in English was definitely a challenge. Obviously, going to an Islamic school definitely helped in terms of just seeing people who were from similar backgrounds, similar stories, similar migration journeys. And so it was challenging, but, you know, as an 8-year-old kid, you pick up things really quickly. So before I knew it, you know, English was pretty fluent, had made friends. But I think my biggest challenge that even my dad sort of sat me down in my early teens was when I decided to wear the headscarf, the hijab.
Yeah, right.
And he literally sat me down and he was like, "Are you serious about this? Like, do you know what the implications are? This is going to be a lifelong commitment. You know, you can't just wear it today and take it off tomorrow, sort of thing. And you can take your time. Like, there's no rush." And so I didn't really realize that wearing the hijab, you know, would come with its own challenges and struggles, which I later on faced at university.
How did you feel you kind of combated those struggles?
Giving people the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
You know, when people call you towel head or say things like go back to where you came from, or they look at you funny and you stare at you as if you're an alien, or even make comments as ridiculous as, do you have a bomb under that thing on your head? Right. And it's like, are you serious, mate? How'd you make it to uni? This was in my first ever tutorial. And I was like, right. Oh. And so I think it sort of just allowed me to, give them the benefit of the doubt, but also put myself in those positions where I'd be educating them, like sharing my story with them, and like how I got where I am, and like who I am and what I hope to achieve, and we're equals here.
Yeah.
And these are my dreams and aspirations, just like you.
Hmm.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier there that you did attend the Australian Islamic School here in Perth. What were you like as a student?
As a teacher's pet. Everyone hated me. I think during recess and lunchtime, I was mostly hanging out with the teachers. You would sort of get leeway in a sense when you were a good student. But it was, I was an obedient child, but also being the eldest in my family, it just comes inherently where you're a yes person or yes girl to everyone around you. But that bit me in the backside real quick when you grow up and you understand that saying yes is not always a good idea.
We always like to ask this question, it gives us a good insight into who you are as a person and how you grew up. And at school, did you have a favourite and least favourite subject?
So favourite subject, I would like to think, was maths, even though I wasn't great at it. So I really enjoyed maths, but my least favourite subject was health.
Health, wow.
And the reason why health I didn't enjoy too much is because there was a lot of self-reflection, and I think I wasn't great at self-reflecting. And, they'd ask about, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? And it's like, why do I have to talk about this? But yeah, I'd say those were the two that stand out.
I think that's first on the show here. I don't think we've had health brought up before, so that's an interesting one. During your final year of high school, you served as head girl. Do you look back on that now and see that as an early exposure to leadership? And, if so, what did that teach you?
Definitely improved my sense of responsibility and delegation and working in a team. Also allowed me to develop those communication skills of liaising with peers, but also those in higher senior positions like teachers or the Dean of Education and Dean of Behaviour. But yeah, I would say that it really gave me that different perspective of like, you can be amongst your peers, but you have this sense of responsibility to always keep an eye out on things happening and looking after them. It's that sort of nurturing and caring role that I took on board.
Yeah. Looking now to the post-high school period, we were talking just before about how you went to uni and politics wasn't initially on the cards. Instead, you studied pharmacy, and I think there was dreams of medicine. Where did this aspiration actually come from?
So my dad, he was studying medicine back in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And so it was almost like I couldn't achieve medicine and become a doctor, but you can, and you should definitely try and aspire to it. And so being a yes girl, I was like, sure, Dad, if that's what you think I'm gonna achieve or be great at. But despite trying so hard, sitting the GAMSAT, the UMAT, currently it's called UCAT, like all these pre-med exams, it was really, I realized that it just wasn't for me. I also pass out when I see blood, so definitely not a good trait for a doctor. And I think when my dad was diagnosed with leukemia in 2017, that's when he asked, he was like, look, I know that you've tried for medicine and it's not working. And I know you've done an arts degree in anthropology and sociology, but I want you to have a sustainable future where, you're financially independent and have a secure job. So why don't you consider pharmacy? And I was like, I'm not going to say no to my dad when he's sick.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, Dad, I'll give it a crack. And I did, and I got in to Masters of Pharmacy at UWA, and it just wasn't for me, especially, I guess, after Dad's passing, I was like, well, I was doing this for Dad, and I tried hard, and I was barely scraping like a high credit. I was like, this isn't for me.
Yeah. So then the decision comes to pivot into something a bit more political. Can you tell me how that came about?
It was thanks to my psychologist, actually. I started seeing a psychologist 3 months after Dad's passing, upon the recommendation of a friend, and I thank that friend, I'm forever indebted to her. But the psychologist allowed me to explore the ideas of like, all right, do some serious self-reflection. And this is when I was like, man, I should have paid attention to health classes in school. But did some serious self-reflection, and within that, I realized all the struggles that Dad had gone through and the guilt that I felt for or not guilt, but like feeling like I need to honor those sacrifices, and how am I going to do that? But I also just jumped into volunteering. So went through different charity organizations and dedicated my time in just helping the community, which I really enjoyed. And then when I felt that there were certain injustices, inequalities, and the struggles that my dad had gone through as a migrant worker, working around the clock, being underpaid, overworked, and just not knowing his rights, it pivoted me towards if you want to see change, you've got to be within it. You've got to be part of it. And I think that's when I started thinking about politics, and coincidentally met my future boss, Pierre Yang, who's the upper house member for North Metro now.
Yeah.
And he really took me under his wing and, introduced me to Young Labor, which is the youth wing of the Labor Party here in WA. And that's when I felt that level of connection and that sense of belonging. Like, this is my crowd. Like, I jam with these people.
Yeah, you're answering all my questions, therefore, because the next question, talking about your work with, I know you also worked with the United Workers Union and Youth Labour, as you just mentioned, there's that exposure to political organisations. Does that really shape you and help you really decide that this is what you wanted to do?
100%.
Yeah.
I think feeling that sense of camaraderie, young people who are passionate about making change, advocating for social justice, and issues that are, that affects us as young people, but also that will have ripple effects within society. And, whether it's climate change, accessible housing, just education per se, in terms of both higher education and having that access within the regions. It was seeing those policies come up and people feeling so passionate about it. I was like, this is my calling.
I also want to highlight there, you mentioned the volunteering, which is such an important thing, but obviously as uni students and as young people working, it can be so hard to find the time and the motivation to do something like that. But looking back now, how important do you see volunteering as part of, what shaped you and what raised you?
Having ethnic parents, they were like, you're not getting any money for working all these hours. And I was like, yeah, but I'm getting that sense of fulfillment. I'm developing my social skills. I'm meeting incredible people. And the networks that you get exposed to, they're phenomenal. And so I was like, this is me making a difference in my small way. And there doesn't have to be a monetary exchange all the time. Because without volunteers, big organizations won't thrive and incredible movements won't happen. And that's because when we volunteer, it comes from the heart. We really want to make a difference. And I think it was a huge part of my experience and what shaped me and who I am today.
Looking now towards the lead up to last year, May last year, you're moving towards the 2022 election. But how did you decide to run?
So as the third spot on the Senate ticket, we hadn't won it. Labor hadn't won it since 1984. So when I was asked if I would consider putting my name down, I was like, well, it'll probably be a good experience, losing my dad when he was only 47 years old. I was like, I don't even know if I'm going to live to see 47. So why don't I just give it a crack? Take every opportunity as it comes. And if it's not for me, just opt out. Except with this, I was like, if I win, there is no opting out for 6 years. But I was like, winning is not on the card. So this is going to be an excellent experience. I love campaigning, love door knocking and talking to people. And so for me, it was just another opportunity to ensure that we get a progressive government that will lead the way for us. So for me, that was the goal. And I was like, well, you know, I'm just going to put my name down and see where this goes, but also get young people more involved. Because, you know, as a young person, being the voice for young people, I was like, this is our opportunity to really push for a government that will create change in the spaces that we're passionate about.
It's hard to contextualize the job of a politician for some people, you know, but it is a job. And if you look at the campaign as the longest job interview process ever, can you tell me what the actual campaign process was like? Did you feel much pressure throughout?
No. And I think that was the joy of being number 3 on the ticket, right? No expectations. Everyone's like, oh yeah, like, you know, Fatima's there. But I was very heavily involved in our House of Representative members, so the federal seats. And I was ensuring that, you know, we get them elected. They're such fantastic candidates, all of them. And so my time was literally divided trying to door knock and campaign with them. So it was like a morning, afternoon, and like late evening door knocks. And it was fun like I enjoyed it. But not having the pressure allowed me to be more flexible with my time. There was no particular pressure of like, you know, meeting any particular targets or, you know, being seen in a particular way. But it was, the challenging part of it was the uncertainty, obviously not knowing where all this is going. But also I had to renounce my citizenship, which obviously required a lot of back and forth with the Afghan embassy, which obviously was difficult because Afghanistan's government had fallen. So it was just a massive kerfuffle. And but had heaps of support from my state MPs and mentors, and they were just incredible. They were, you know, it was just giving the multicultural community that sense of representation, even though I was just a candidate. They felt like they were finally being seen and heard, and they had a representative in there running as a candidate. So I'd say it inspired quite a few people to take politics quite seriously.
Yeah. Bit of a two-part question here, but, you know, as you're campaigning, first of all, what are the issues that are most important to you and your team and your campaign? And secondly, did those align with what you saw and what you heard door knocking and talking to members of the public?
Yeah, no, 100%. I think one of the biggest areas that we focused on was the National Anti-Corruption Commission, and returning that faith and integrity back into politics and ensuring that, you know, politicians are held to account. And that's exactly what we heard on the doors. Climate change was another one. Exactly what we heard on the doors. Everyone was worried about us not playing our part, especially on the global stage. Like, I think ScoMo didn't do us proud on multiple occasions, but it really highlighted that you just needed to listen to constituents, people on the ground, people who are suffering. Cost of living was on the rise, and just understanding that people are doing it tough out there and they need representatives to listen. And I think politicians need to talk less and listen more.
We of course know now what happened on election night and the massive swing that we saw towards Labor, but that wasn't guaranteed going in. It wasn't even predicted in a lot of spaces. Can you tell me what election night was like for you? Well,
there was no such thing as a safe seat. So we went into the big hall where the counting was done, like we were watching it on the screen. Anthony Green was just, you know, he keeps you on the edge, right? I'm like, oh my God, what's happening? And I think as the numbers from the east sort of start coming a bit earlier because of the time difference, and we were worried. We really were. And it wasn't until counting started here in WA that we saw the numbers sort of go up for Labor and started winning seats that we did not expect, like Tangney and Hasluck.
Yeah.
And as soon as, I guess, Tangney was announced as winning, because Moore was in contention, and then I became in contention because I was like, oh my goodness, this is serious. And complete denial. I was like, yeah, no, this isn't going to happen. This is, no, it's not. But I think the sheer joy of having won government that night and hearing the Prime Minister speak, it was this instant renewal within the whole space. Like, everyone felt this sigh of, like, this sense of relief. Like, we've got a good government. We've got what we were, like, working so hard for. A government that is going to care for our lowest paid workers, a government that is going to care for those young parents and families out there, a government that is going to ensure that people are held accountable and that the work actually gets done. So, yeah, it was sigh of relief.
So you're elected with that 6th and final Senate spot in WA. What was your personal reaction when you found out that you were going to be representing the state?
Oh, I just fell to the ground and I started crying. Called mum, and my mum was in absolute denial herself. She's like, until I see the results, I'm not going to believe it. And I was like, Mum, I won. And she just bursted out crying. And I think the only thing that I was missing that night was I just wish I could see the expression on my dad's face. Like, that would have meant the world to me, just for him to see how far his little girl had come. Yeah.
The election campaign is a whole beast of its own, and then there's election night. And then afterwards, what's the intermediate period like? I know when we talked to Kate Chaney, she pretty much said they give you the keys and say off you go. Was that your experience?
Yeah. No. No, for me, I guess, incredible amount of support. I was receiving calls from all these ministers. The PM called me. I was like, oh my God, I have Albo's number. It was just one of those moments where, like, this is unreal. But it was an incredible sort of transition period where a lot of information is thrown at you, but there's equal amount of support as well from colleagues. So Senator Sue Lyons really helped me establish the office, but also think about ways of, like, ensuring that the team's nice and cohesive, where I would be situated. So I've got Ken White's old office in Forestfield. And just sort of, understanding the ins and outs, what your role pertains and, like, what you've got to do, what your commitments look like. And then we had Senate school. That was fun.
Senate school?
Yes, Senate school was heaps fun. It was like a 2 or 3 day intensive of, like, just information overload. But it was good to sort of meet other senators from, other parties and get to know them. Senator Sue Lyons, as president of the Senate, invited us to dinner one night. So it was good to sort of just get to know your colleagues. Like, David Pocock was probably one that I was like, oh my God, he's a big deal. But yeah, he's super chill. I've met him and his partner, and he's great.
So that's all happening nearly a year ago now. We're coming up to 1 year. What's the political journey been like for you since then?
10 months feels like a long time ago, but it flies by so quickly. I think it's been such a privilege seeing legislation being passed. I'm part of the Education and Employment Committee and Environment and Communications. So both areas that I'm super passionate about. So I was very grateful to be given those committees, but also just sort of being in the process of seeing those legislations go through from the House to the Senate and how it's all debated, what we've got to do. Like, definitely long nights. Like, last fortnight we were up till 4:30 in the morning, and I made sure the Housies did not forget that. I was like, man, you guys, we're doing so much for you. But no, it's so good to see when we're talking to voters out there. Like, I was door knocking with Emily Hamilton a month ago, and talking to locals and telling them about what we've delivered so far. They were surprised in terms of like, oh wow, you guys have done this in like 8 months, and it's like, yeah, well, that's our job as the government. We're supposed to deliver. We're supposed to do what we promised. So it's kind of sad that they have such low expectations of the government, but also, we haven't wasted a single day, and we've been working nonstop. And I guess being part of a huge, massive, diverse caucus and being part of those conversations, seeing those ministers get up and like speak on their legislation, what they've got in store for us, Australia is in good hands.
Love to hear it. Now, this is probably a hard question, but over the past 10 months, is there a particular highlight of what you've done? Yeah.
Oh my goodness, that is a very tough question because I think there are just so many. It's hard to pick exactly one. I must say, seeing from its inception, essentially, the Secure Jobs Better Pay bill get passed and see how much of an impact that's made in workers' lives has made me feel like I've done justice to the sacrifices of my dad to a certain degree, like knowing that, if he was still around and he was, working as a kitchen hand, that he would be protected and there would be safeguards in place to ensure that he's being paid the minimum wage. He is aware of his rights and, conditions within a workplace. So that was definitely a highlight. I think another one would be when Senator Penny Wong, as our foreign minister, asked me to represent her at a conference in Bali for a day. And it was such a phenomenal experience, but to also be talking about the rights of women and girls to education. And this was in particular in the context of Afghanistan. And so it was so good to see Australia as a key player, because conversations around climate change and how we need to talk about that and keep that as a key concern also came up. So it's great to see Australia's reputation being restored in the international stage.
We won't keep you for too much longer, but before we do go, I know you mentioned before you didn't love reflection questions in health, but we do love to finish with some reflection questions, so I'm going to put you in the hot seat here. Just two reflection questions that we love to ask everyone that comes on the show. First off, over the journey, is there something that sticks out, something that you think you might like to change along the way?
About myself?
About, anything you've done, the way you've how you've gotten here. Yeah.
What I would change would be perhaps managing expectations of myself, of those around me, and just being real about, yes, you've got 24 hours in a day, but, how many things can you say yes to, right? And it's always hard to say no to the incredible communities out there who want me out and about. But yeah, that's definitely something that I would reflect on more, and I'm working on it. My team keeps me in check most of the time.
Finally, a hypothetical that we do like to pose to everyone here on the show is your 15-year-old self is sitting in front of you. What advice are you giving her?
I would tell her to be kind to herself, right? I would tell her that the world can be cruel at times, but there's goodness out there, that perfectionism is not always the best way to go, and to just be comfortable in her skin. Like, she's beautiful for who she is, and kindness goes a long way.
That about wraps it up here today on How Did I Get Here. You can find us, student_edge on Instagram, Student Edge on TikTok. Search us up, Student Edge, or How Did I Get Here on YouTube, and head to studentedge.org for all our articles, podcast deals, competitions, career tips, education advice, and much, much more. Senator Fatima Payman, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute blast.